All right, so we're back and ready for another deep dive into the news. Today is Sunday, March 2nd, 2025. And let me tell you, things are getting interesting out there in the world. We've got headlines that'll make you laugh, make you cry, and maybe even make you facepalm a little. We've pulled from sources like the New York Times, the Atlantic Politico, even some independent blogs to get a good mix of perspectives.
Sounds like we've got a full plate.
Oh, we do.
Yeah.
So buckle up because we're about to jump right in. Let's kick things off with a story that's dominating the news cycle right now. The Oval Office showdown between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky.
Ah, yes, that was quite the encounter.
To put it mildly, Alan Tonelson in his blog, Reality Check, actually called it a public cage fight. And based on the reports, he might not be far off.
It was definitely a tense meeting. You could cut the tension with a knife. President Trump and Vice President Vance, they really went after Zelensky, pressing him hard to accept a ceasefire with Russia.
And it sounds like they didn't exactly mince words.
No, they did not. They even implied that Zelensky was being ungrateful for the aid the U.S. has been providing to Ukraine. Which is, a pretty loaded statement considering Ukraine is literally fighting for its survival.
Right. I mean, talk about adding fuel to the fire. The fallout from this meeting has been pretty explosive, too.
Right.
We've got heavy hitters like John Bolton and Senator Chris Murphy publicly condemning Trump's approach, while some Republicans are circling the wagons defending his actions.
It's definitely a divisive issue, and the public is getting involved, too. There were protests outside of Vice President Vance's Vermont ski vacation home following the meeting. Some people were even chanting, "Go ski in Russia."
Ouch, that's gotta sting.
Right.
So what does all of this tell us about President Trump's foreign policy style? And how will this impact the war in Ukraine? These are the million-dollar questions right now.
Absolutely. This whole incident could signal a significant shift in U.S. foreign policy, potentially towards a more isolationist or transactional approach. The implications for global alliances and for the war itself are huge. We need to keep a close eye on how this unfolds.
Agreed. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the U.S. economy, which isn't exactly painting a rosy picture at the moment. The Atlanta Fed's GDP Now tracker is actually predicting negative growth for the first quarter of 2025.
Yeah, not great news. And when you combine that with inflation, which is still stubbornly high and squeezing consumer spending, it's a recipe for concern.
Definitely, a lot of folks are feeling the pinch. So for those who might not be familiar with all the economic jargon, can you explain what this GDP Now tracker is and why we should care about it?
Sure, thinking. So the GDP Now tracker is basically a real-time estimate of how fast the economy is growing, or in this case, shrinking. It uses constantly updating data to give us a snapshot of where things stand. While it can be a bit volatile, especially early in the quarter, it's still a useful tool for getting a sense of where the economy might be headed. And right now, it's flashing some warning signs.
Got it. So not exactly smooth sailing on the economic front. And to add to the mix, we've also got some government cuts making headlines. Two examples really jumped out at me. The first is potential budget cuts to the National Weather Service, which the New York Times is reporting could seriously jeopardize public safety during severe weather events. And then there's the dismantling of the General Services Administration's tech unit, 18F.
Yeah, those cuts are concerning. 18F played a crucial role in modernizing government services, making them more user-friendly and efficient. Dismantling it, as Politico reported, could lead to a lot of headaches down the road. Less efficient services, more bureaucracy. The drill.
And of course, these cuts are part of the Trump administration, the larger push to reduce government spending and shrink the federal workforce.
Right. It's all connected.
So the big question here is, what are the trade-offs? Are we sacrificing long-term stability and efficiency for short-term savings? And what impact will these decisions have on essential services and ultimately the lives of everyday citizens?
These are questions we need to be asking.
Absolutely. Now let's turn to a piece of news that's actually quite hopeful. Reason.com is reporting on some promising early results from a pancreatic cancer vaccine trial.
Now, this is exciting stuff. Pancreatic cancer is one of the deadliest forms of cancer out there. It has a notoriously low survival rate, so even a small advancement like this vaccine could be a real game changer.
Why is pancreatic cancer so difficult to treat in the first place?
It's a combination of things. It's often very aggressive, and by the time it's detected, it's often already spread. This new vaccine offers a glimmer of hope, but of course we need more research before we can pop the champagne.
Right. It's still early days, but this is definitely something to watch. Okay, shifting gears again. we need to talk about the controversy swirling around Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his stance on vaccines.
This has been a hot topic for sure.
Kennedy has a long history with the anti-vaccine movement, and his appointment has raised a lot of eyebrows among public health experts.
To say the least, the 19th actually featured a really powerful story from a mother whose son is immunocompromised. She talked about how these anti-vaccine sentiments have real-world consequences for vulnerable people like her son.
Her story really highlights how these debates aren't just theoretical. They have a direct impact on people's lives.
Absolutely, they do.
So with Kennedy at the helm of HHS, how will this affect public health policy and vaccination rates in the U.S.? This is a big question mark hanging over everything right now.
It is a big one.
Let's move on to our final story for this segment. The media world is abuzz with news of a major shakeup at the Washington Post. Their opinion section is getting a makeover to align with libertarian priorities.
Yeah, I read about that.
This shift has already led to the resignation of their opinion editor, and there are rumors swirling about mass cancellations from subscribers.
It's a big deal.
It is, and it raises some important questions about the influence of money on the news we consume and the future of journalistic independence. The Washington Post situation is actually part of a larger trend of billionaires acquiring media outlets.
It makes you wonder who controls the narrative these days.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
So there you have it, folks. A whirlwind tour of the day's top headlines. From political showdowns and economic jitters to a glimmer of hope in medical research and some soul-searching in the media landscape.
A lot to unpack.
We'll be back soon to dig even deeper into these stories and explore what they all mean. Stay with us.
Welcome back to our deep dive. Let's circle back to that heated Oval Office meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky.
Oh yeah, that was definitely a moment. What stood out to you from that whole exchange?
You know, it's interesting. That whole incident, it kind of highlights this larger trend we're seeing in global politics, this growing tension between the U.S. and its traditional allies.
You're talking about the idea that the U.S. under the Trump administration is putting its own interests ahead of international cooperation.
Exactly. There's this shift happening towards a more isolationist America First stance, and it's causing friction with some of our longtime partners like France and the UK.
And this shift has a direct impact on the situation in Ukraine.
Oh, absolutely. If the U.S. pulls back from its role as a global leader, it creates a vacuum that other powerful nations like Russia could be all too happy to fill.
So what happens in Ukraine doesn't stay in Ukraine. It has ripple effects across the world.
It's all interconnected. This brings us back to those economic concerns we touched on earlier. The Atlanta Fed predicting negative growth, the persistent inflation. All of that is partly fueled by this global instability. When things feel uncertain around the world, investors get nervous. And that can send shockwaves through the entire global economy.
So it's a domino effect.
In a way. And that connects to another point we discussed, the potential consequences of those government cuts. Those cuts to the National Weather Service. The dismantling of that tech unit 18F, those might seem like isolated incidents, but they're part of this bigger pattern of prioritizing short-term cost savings over long-term investment.
And that can come back to bite us later.
Right. Exactly. A less effective response to natural disasters, slower rollout of vital government services. These things can impact everyone.
It's all about the long game.
It is. Now let's talk about that bit of good news we uncovered. The pancreatic cancer vaccine.
Oh, yeah. That was a bright spot in all of this.
It really was. But, you know, even this story highlights a major challenge we're facing, the spread of misinformation.
You're talking about the anti-vaccine movement and how those ideas persist, even though the science is pretty clear.
Exactly. It's becoming harder and harder to separate fact from fiction.
Okay.
And that has real-world consequences. Remember that story from the 19th, the mother whose son is immunocompromised? She talked about how these anti-vaccine beliefs directly affect vulnerable people like her son.
That's a powerful reminder that these aren't just abstract debates. They have a real human impact.
They really do. Okay, now let's loop back to that media shakeup at the Washington Post.
That shift towards libertarian viewpoints
Yeah.
and how it might impact their coverage, it's definitely concerning.
This whole situation really underscores how important media literacy is these days. We all need to be critical thinkers. When we're consuming news, we need to consider the source, their biases, their motivations.
Especially in today's media landscape,
Mm-hmm.
where it's so easy to get trapped in these echo chambers where you're only exposed to information that reinforces your existing beliefs.
Exactly. That can lead to a very distorted view of the world. So as you're following these news stories, I want you to ask yourself, where am I getting my information? What are their motivations? Am I getting the full picture?
Those are good questions for any informed citizen. So as we look at all of these stories together, What are some of the big themes that stand out to you?
One theme that keeps coming up is this decline in trust in institutions. Whether it's the government, the media, even scientific experts, there's this growing sense of skepticism and disillusionment.
And that's dangerous, right?
hmm
What happens when we lose faith in the systems that are supposed to serve us?
It can create a breeding ground for division and instability. And this erosion of trust is often fueled by the rapid spread of misinformation, which makes it even harder to separate fact from fiction and make informed decisions.
So that's a vicious cycle.
It can be. In today's world where things are so complex and changing so rapidly, staying well informed is more crucial than ever. As you continue to engage with the news, be vigilant, be critical, and be willing to challenge your own assumptions.
That's great advice. We'll be back in a moment to wrap up this deep dive. Stay tuned. Welcome back for the final stretch of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have, yeah. From those political fireworks and economic uncertainties to that glimmer of hope in medical research and those big shifts happening in the media landscape, it's been a lot to process.
It has. And, amid all these headlines, I keep circling back to this one question. What does it all mean? Like, how do all of these seemingly separate stories connect to the bigger picture?
That's the core of it, isn't it? We've talked about the decline in trust in institutions, the rise of misinformation, the challenges of staying informed in a world where everyone's shouting their own version of the truth. But the real question is, what do you do with this information? How do you use it to navigate your own life, your own choices?
It's tough, right? It's so easy to get overwhelmed by the constant barrage of news, especially when so much of it is negative or contradictory.
Oh, it definitely is. But that's why it's more important than ever to be a discerning consumer of information. You need to figure out how to filter out the noise, how to identify reliable sources, how to think critically about what you're reading and hearing.
So it's not just about passively absorbing the news, it's about actively engaging with it, questioning it, letting it shape your understanding of the world.
Exactly. And it's about remembering that you're not just an observer, you're a participant. The choices you make every single day have an impact, whether it's how you vote, what you buy, even what you share on social media.
So what's the takeaway here? What do we do with all this information and all this uncertainty?
Stay curious, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay hopeful. Remember that even amidst all the chaos and complexity, there are always opportunities for positive change. We can choose to be informed, engaged citizens who contribute to a better future. It's a choice we make every day.
That's a great point. And I think this deep dive today has really driven home the importance of staying informed, thinking critically, and taking action. Even when the news is tough, even when it feels like the world is spinning a little too fast. So keep those brains buzzing, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow for another deep dive into the news that matters.